Hello, my name is Deborah Cox Callister, and I'm with the Department of Communication at the University of Utah. And I wish, I wish to thank all of you for your participation throughout the conference. Also like to thank the Barbara and Norman Tanner Center for Nonviolent Human Rights Advocacy, and the Interdisciplinary Conference Planning Team, along with Tom Maloney and Johanna Watzinger-Tharp, and their tremendous leadership. I'd also like to thank both the University of Utah College of Humanities and the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences for the support in developing the Peace and Conflict Studies program at the University of Utah, and last but not least, the David C. Williams Memorial Scholarship, which made it possible for me to be present with you here today. Throughout this conference, we've heard a rich array of perspectives on water, conflict, and human rights, ranging from global to local. With our final panel, we will continue this pattern of looking at case studies well beyond our borders and moving closer to where we sit on the rim of the Great Basin to our immediate west. Each panelist will speak for 20 minutes, enabling time for questions and an opportunity for all of us to build on ideas that have been shared throughout this cross-disciplinary water conference on conflict and human rights. It will be a time where we can synthesize lessons learned and explore plausible pathways for creating healthy water futures. Our first panelist is Joseph Dellapenna, Professor of Law at Villanova. Professor Dellapenna, among many other roles, is the rapporteur for the Water Resources Committee of the International Law Association, with the charge to redraft the Helsinki Rules on transboundary water management in light of developments in the international water law and international environmental law over 35 years since the original Helsinki Rules were approved. For more information on his lifetime of accomplishments in transnational litigation, please see his biography and CV. Without further delay, please help me welcome Joseph Dellapenna, who today will share details about conflicts and cooperation in the Dead Sea Basin.
Let's see if I can get this up.
Would you like it dark enough?
Yeah, whoops, I don't know what happened.
Okay, there you go.
Okay, I currently am a legal consultant at World Bank's feasibility study on the proposed Red Dead project. This is a proposal to divert a substantial amount of water out of the Red Sea to replenish, or at least provide water along the way to replenishing the Dead Sea, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. Actually, quite a lot more in a few minutes. The basic problem that the World Bank sees as presented by this project is the question of whether it will foster the peace process in the region. And so they, unlike a lot of their projects, the lawyers called in at the last minute after all the decisions have been made and basically told, write this up. I've been involved from the very beginning because my responsibility in the project is to propose institutional arrangements between the three national communities, Israelis, Jordanians, and Palestinians, that would promise both to make the project a success on the technical side, but also might promote cooperation that might, just might, help ease tensions in other respects. So I've been an active participant from the very beginning. I'm going back to the region in about 2 weeks to talk again to the various government representatives about the structure I'm proposing, and so that's the basis of this particular discussion. Okay. Now this is a map. I don't know how well you can see it because of the scale of basically the Middle East. Egypt here, much in the news, Iraq here, And right a little narrow strip along the Mediterranean coast is Israel. And an even tinier space wedged between Israel and the Kingdom of Jordan is what's called the West Bank, or the Palestinian territories. Linked politically, but not geographically, with the West Bank is the city of Gaza, the Gaza Strip, which is on the Mediterranean. And then across the Jordan River you have Kingdom of Jordan, Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. So that's the location. And see if we can get this region, the Middle East, is the center of the largest dry region on the planet. It stretches, if you're wondering, it stretches from the Atlantic Ocean, the coast of North Africa, Morocco, Western Sahara, Mauritania, all the way across, with some interruptions, all the way across to the Gobi Desert in Mongolia and North China. Now, there are a number of places where the desert is briefly interrupted, primarily by mountain ranges, and in some cases by large rivers like the Nile, goes through Egypt, the Tigris and Euphrates here, the Indus over on India, the Sir Daria and Amu Daria that Peter, I think it was Peter Gleck mentioned in his talk. Those rivers all essentially originate outside the desert. And for most of them, they originate outside the Middle East. They float into the desert, and they create the possibility of agriculture and therefore substantial populations, but only in the near vicinity of the rivers. And these rivers are what are called exotic rivers. That is, they become smaller as they approach the sea. Now, in wet climates, you expect rivers to become larger as they approach the sea. But these rivers all become smaller. And that's in their natural condition they become smaller, because they receive essentially no input of rain or snow once they enter the desert. And they evaporate, seep into the ground, and so on. And of course, that process of losing water is exacerbated when you have large human settlements along their banks. Now, throughout history, throughout human history, these river basins have given rise to large empires. And the last of the large empires was the Ottoman Empire that was carved up in 1918 at the end of World War I. And many of the regions, Saudi Arabia in particular, to a significant extent Jordan, Libya, so on, depend on fossil water. That's a term you also heard yesterday. This is water, groundwater that was stored in wetter times, tens of thousands of years ago, literally, and has not been replenished since. So when you pump it out of the ground, it's gone. It's like oil in that regard. Water in a wetter climate is a renewable resource. In a climate as dry as this region, it is not a renewable resource. At least a great deal of it is not. Now, this is a closer map of the basin of the Jordan River. Again, you have Gaza there. You have Israel essentially along the Mediterranean. You have the West Bank. And then across the river, you have the Kingdom of Jordan. The Jordan River begins from 3 springs on the slopes of Mount Hermon. And there actually is considerable dispute as to which country those various springs are located in. That's been one of the impediments in reaching a peace treaty between Israel and Syria and Israel and Lebanon. And each spring gives rise to a small river that join together to form the Jordan, just above its natural reservoir, which is known in English as the Sea of Galilee, in Hebrew as Kinneret, and in Arabic the name translates as Lake Tiberias. So you even have disputes about what the name of that natural reservoir is. And then it flows down into the Rift Valley. The Rift Valley begins in Syria and southern Turkey and extends all the way down to South Africa. And it's basically a huge split in the earth. Now, at the end of, or at the deepest part of the Rift Valley in this part of Actually, the deepest part of the river valley anywhere is the Dead Sea. It is what you call a terminal lake. I like to call it a sink or a sump. It's the deepest part. It's, in fact, the deepest point on the surface of the planet. Not talking about, well below sea level, several hundred meters below sea level, the surface of the Dead Sea, and it's fallen. Water in its natural condition, the Jordan River fed into the lake. No water fed out of the lake except by evaporation. Jordan receives one major tributary, which is the Yarmouk River, which arises in Syria and flows down to Jordan and Israel before it reaches the Jordan River. And today, both the Yarmouk and the Jordan are hopelessly overexploited, and there's virtually no water flowing. There's a very tiny amount of water flowing into the Dead Sea, only because it's considered unfit for human use. And the results are entirely predictable. The Dead Sea is dying. Now, further complicating the picture, you've got aquifers. Israel and Jordan share the waters of the Jordan and the Yarmouk. The Palestinians are not allowed to use the waters of the Jordan or the Yarmouk. They are entirely dependent on what's called the mountain aquifer, which is actually 3 aquifers. And you can see the direction of flow of the water in the aquifers as it seeps down towards the lower regions. Most of the rain that feeds the aquifers falls on the West Bank hills. That is in the Palestinian territories. The major consumer of water out of the mountain aquifer system is Israel. The Palestinians, however, get all of their water that they consume out of the mountain aquifer. Israel controls how much they're allowed to consume and so on. There are already 10 minutes gone. I can't believe that. All right. There are proposals, for example, continue to be proposals to bring water into the Jordan Valley from nearby rivers that are not actually part of the watershed. You've got the Litani in Lebanon. And I won't go into that. You've got the Orontes in Lebanon, Syria, and Turkey. You've got, of course, the aquifers I've talked about. Skip along. You've got a coastal aquifer, which is mostly in Israel, partly in Gaza, and there's a dispute as to whether that's 1 aquifer or 2 aquifers. And, I'm going to have to go very fast. Israel is, of course, a semi-arid land, has a growing population. The fastest segment of the population that's growing in Israel, by the way, are Israeli citizens who are Arabs, but has European standards of water consumption. It's not as high as American standards, but it's among the highest in the region. Kingdom of Jordan is an arid land, not a semi-arid land. It has a burgeoning population, and it also has masses of refugees. Although refugees, and you hear the phrase refugee camp, this is not people living in tents. These are people, the families of people who've been living in Jordan since 1948 or since 1967, and they have permanent homes and so on. But this is part of the political problems within Jordan. This is disagreements between the Bedouin, the traditional Jordanians, and the Palestinians. Per capita consumption in Jordan is about 1/3 of per capita consumption in Israel. Lebanon we can skip over, although it's arguably a water surplus state, but it's very politically unstable. Palestine, and that I mean the Palestinian territories. The West Bank and Gaza is a semi-arid land, also has a burgeoning population. Jordan, Palestine, both have among the highest population growth rates in the world. Water consumption levels are lower than Jordan. And remember, Jordanian water consumption is 1/3 of the Israeli per capita water consumption. And one of the resentments you've got lots of resentments, obviously, but one of the resentments the Palestinians have is that Israeli settlements have swimming pools. And ancient Palestinian olive groves are dying for lack of water, and they're often within sight of each other. And as I mentioned, the Jordan River is itself unusable. The Israelis extract virtually all of the usable water before it reaches the Palestinian territory, so that's not a source. And water usage in the Palestinian territory has never been under Palestinian control. The Israeli settlements, there's about 300,000 people. The Palestinian in the West Bank population is well over 2 million. Israeli settlements, about 300,000 people. Those 300,000 people consume more water than the Palestinians do in the West Bank. Syria, I won't talk about at this point. All right, so you've got a long history of, which I think I'm going to skip over. Let's go down. Yeah. Got a long history of plans for water development. Now, where are we? There we are. And I'm going to skip over that at this point in the interest of time. And a long history of water disputes. One thing I will say, there's also a long history of water cooperation. Israel and Jordan, Israel and the Palestinians have, in fact, covertly cooperated over water pretty much throughout their history. You can count the number of times when water facilities have been targeted on the hands of fingers of one hand, in fact. And in fact, when the peace negotiations broke down, I was an active player in the peace negotiations in the 1990s. When that broke down with the what's called the Second Intifada, the outburst of violence beginning around 2000, the one thing that was exempted from, largely exempted anyway, from the serious constraints that the Israelis imposed upon the Palestinian people were people working for the Palestinian Water Authority. And there's actually been a great deal of cooperation over water, even during the most violent periods of time. Now, take a look at the Dead Sea for just a minute. This, of course, is one of the things, if you know anything about the Dead Sea, you know it is, in fact, the saltiest body of water, natural body of water on the surface of the planet. And so one of the things it's famous for is floating, reading newspapers or whatever. Is also the lowest. The land surrounding the Dead Sea is the lowest dry land on the planet. It is a source of minerals for industry. That's one of the problems. I mean, the major problem is the fact that you no longer have water entering the Dead Sea to replenish it. But another problem is both Israel and Jordan have major mineral industries that essentially extract minerals by pumping water out of the Dead Sea into evaporation ponds. Its muds are reputed to have health and beauty effects, so one of the things you can do if you go to either Israel or Jordan, go to a resort and take mud baths. Or you can buy Dead Sea salts to bring home and bathe in. And it is home to unique forms of life adapted to its unique ecology. Okay, well, go back. This is an example, this time a man taking a mud bath. That should make you all want to run out there, right? Now, the Dead Sea today. This is a map. Let's see if I can get it. 1848. This is a map of the Dead Sea. And if you'd drawn the map of the Dead Sea in 1948, it would have looked substantially the same. 1948, of course, when Israel became independent. This is a map of the Dead Sea today. It is, in fact, two lakes. The Dead Sea is dropping by about 1 meter, that's about 3 feet a year, the level. It's dropped so much that what was once one large lake is now two lakes. And this lower lake would not exist at all except they pump water from the upper lake, because that's where the mineral extraction industries are. And so they first pump the water into the lower lake, and then they pump it out into the evaporation ponds. And so the Dead Sea is literally disappearing. Now, I've mentioned the reasons already, and I'm getting a lot of time. So, the proposed solution is the Red Dead diversion. Take water from the Red Sea, you pump it up over a mountain range right by the coast, and it will flow by gravity all the way down to the Dead Sea. Remember, Dead Sea's 100, I think the current level is 400 feet below sea level. Something like it's dropped so much. It used to be something like 280 feet below sea level. Now it's 420 feet below sea level. And so it'll flow by gravity all the way down to the Dead Sea. So the only energy input you need is to pump it over that first range of mountains. And they'll actually run it through a tunnel. Now, supposedly, and this is public relations message, this is to restore the Dead Sea, but in fact when you talk to the officials that are planning it, you talk to the government officials on what they're looking for, they actually say we're going to use it to generate electricity, and then we'll use that electricity as it flows downhill. We'll use that electricity to desalinate water, and what we'll really do is produce water primarily for Jordan, secondarily for the Palestinians. The Israelis want only a token amount just to make sure they have a seat at the table. And so it won't really do very much of anything to restore the Dead Sea. Instead, what they'll dump into the Dead Sea is a heavy salinated brine that's left over after desalination. It not only won't restore it, it won't even stabilize it. It will continue to fall. So this is a quick look at the map. Here's the Red Sea at Aqaba. It will run in this particular plan, and there are alternate routes proposed. It would run more or less right along the Jordanian-Israeli border. Now, since I'm now down to 1 minute, let me just say, rather than trying to go through the rest of the PowerPoints, I know, I need the microphone. You've got a lot of problems. From a legal point of view, from a political point of view, the engineering problems can be solved. The environmental consequences are probably not good. They're not good under the present situation, and the Red Dead project is probably not going to help on the environmental scene, because I am assured by the engineers and I'm assured by the government officials that they are aware of this and it doesn't bother them, that this project will not stop the lowering of the Dead Sea. And to the extent that any water is added, as I said, it will be a very heavily salinated brine. It will not. It will increase the salinity of the Dead Sea, and it's very likely that the species that are found only in the Dead Sea will quickly go extinct. I personally have, although this is not my responsibility in consulting with the World Bank, I have serious questions about the cost-benefit aspects of the project. But the political ramifications are such that the three governments all seem committed to going forward with it. Whether the World Bank will fund it is a separate question, and as I won't make that decision either. I have my input on whether they can set up the necessary institutions. So this is a very serious problem, and you see here a complex attempt to create not only a project but a set of institutions related to that project that hopefully can lead to the accomplishment of its goals. Whether they will succeed is, in my view, an open question. And I'm out of time, so I will stop.
No doubt. Thank you, Professor Dellapenna. Our second panelist, Dr. Michael Campana, is a professor of hydrogeology and water resources at Oregon State University, who has worked for decades of his professional life in the more arid states of Nevada and New Mexico. Dr. Campana's research interests range from transboundary groundwater resources to water resources in developing regions, especially Central America and Central Asia. Today we will hear from him about a groundwater conflict between the city of Memphis and the state of Mississippi. Please help me welcome Dr. Michael Campana.
I need an assistant to help me with my PowerPoint because my nearsightedness is great. Excellent. First of all, I want to thank the powers that be for inviting me here. This is really a remarkable conference. I always love to go to meetings where I meet people that either I've never met before or who are from different disciplines. I was trained as a hydrogeologist, although I don't really do much of that anymore. I especially want to thank Barbara Tanner for having the foresight to set up this center, and I'd like to thank Tom Maloney, Alita too, and Victoria Medina for treating us like royalty. I also want to thank Stephen Berrien of the University of Utah, because I think Steve suggested to them that they asked me to come, but of course at the time he didn't know I was going to talk about this stuff. So anyway, first of all, people, I know most of you are here because you want to know the origin of the title, okay, and then you're going to go, okay. So what's the business with what would Elvis say, okay? Where was Elvis born? Mississippi. Tupelo, Mississippi. You take I-22 southeast of Memphis, a couple hours, you're in Tupelo, okay. What was his adopted home, and where did he get his musical start? Memphis. So this is a story of conflict on two levels, not just between Memphis and Mississippi, but Elvis himself would be terribly conflicted with this lawsuit, because which side do you take? Okay, anyway. Now, since Graceland is in Memphis, he would probably side with Memphis. Okay, anyway, enough of it. Here's my presentation outline. You'll notice that there are no summary or conclusions. That's because there are none. Okay? Now, a couple of definitions. Why am I doing Memphis, and why am I doing it in Salt Lake City? Number one, I thought it would be different. Number two, this is what they call an asymmetric problem. You have a state which is at a higher political level than, say, a city arguing about something. It also deals with groundwater in an area that gets 55 inches of rain or precipitation a year. Now, I live in Western Oregon, which is horribly wet, and this is 50% more than we get. So fighting over groundwater in an area that has one of the largest rivers in the world at its front door, the Mississippi. So what's the deal? Okay. The deal is, I think this is the shape of things to come, not just in the U.S., but in the world. We're going to see more fights over groundwater, and when I say fight, I don't necessarily mean shooting, but I mean lawsuits, etc. Now, definitions. In the old days, if someone came more than 500 or 600 miles to a meeting with colored transparencies, you were by definition an expert. Okay. These days, if you blog or tweet on a topic, you're an expert. Now, since I fulfill both these characteristics, I am by definition an expert on the Memphis sand aquifer. And I didn't realize this until people started emailing and calling me about 3 or 4 years ago. And it was actually because I had started a blog, shameless plug here. And by the way, this presentation I've already posted on my blog, so you can pick it up there. I started getting calls from Tom Charlier, who's a reporter for the Memphis Commercial Appeal, the largest newspaper in the region. And then Mississippi Public Radio called me and blah, blah, blah. And they wanted to get someone who was out of the area. So I fulfilled that characteristic. Some things about Memphis, you may not be familiar with it. It's a major southern city, 700,000 people, half decent-sized metropolitan area. I guess maybe slightly smaller than Salt Lake metro area, something like that. One of its claims to fame is that as of 2009, had the largest cargo airport in the world because it's the FedEx headquarters and its major hub. Now, I'm sure that when the 2010 figures come out, Hong Kong will have replaced it because they were running neck and neck. So they will lose that claim to fame. But it has a great musical heritage, but we won't go into that. Okay. Hard to see. This really came out real well. Anyway, this is southwestern Tennessee here. Okay. Trust me on this, okay? This is Shelby County, and the Mississippi River runs right here. I have a better map later on, but boy, did that wash out. More on the Memphis background. Okay, now we're getting into the meat of the issue. Memphis Light Gas and Water is a city-owned utility, and I believe it is the largest full-service municipal utility in the country. Full service meaning they do water, they do gas, they do electricity. Anyway. They pump groundwater from a very productive aquifer called the Memphis Sand Aquifer and also a smaller aquifer called the Fort Pillow Sand. They've been doing this since 1924. They're very good at it. The water is excellent quality. They pump a lot of water, 160 to 200 million gallons per day. And Alan Cameron, who was an attorney for the Mississippi side, claims it's the largest city in the world supplied solely by groundwater. Now, that honor used to be held by San Antonio, which is much larger than Memphis, but San Antonio now gets a skosh of its water from surface water, so they're out of the picture. What about the Memphis sand? Well, it covers about 10,000 square miles, and as a hydrogeologist, I love to see very coarse sand because that means it's generally going to conduct water very well. So it has good water storage and transmissive properties. Water can flow through it easily. It's got very high quality groundwater. In fact, Memphis has even been approached by water bottlers for, could we bottle your water and sell it? I don't know what they're going to call it, Mississippi mud or something like that. And again, it's amply recharged by precipitation. You heard Joe talk about fossil aquifers. This is not a fossil aquifer. 55 inches of precip a year. And this is actually what it looks like in cross-section. Now, for those of you who aren't earth scientists, what we've done here, this is a representation. Imagine a layer cake. And imagine a huge layer cake, and you took a knife that was 200 miles long, okay, and the layer cake was 200 miles in circumference. And you just you sliced the cake and took one part away to see what the layers look like inside. Well, that's what we've done here. This is what's called a hydrostratigraphic cross-section. And I say 200 miles because this represents, across the top here, northwest of Memphis, about 100 miles, passing through Memphis, and then to the southeast. So we've essentially cut the earth away along a 200-mile line from the northwest to the southeast. And this is what the geology looks like. Okay? It's exaggerated because the dip of the beds is highly exaggerated. This distance here is only about 3,000 feet, whereas this distance here is about 200 miles. And this is the Memphis sand. The light-colored materials are sands, which are generally good aquifers. The dark-colored materials are finer-grained materials like clays and silts, which are generally not good aquifers. So Memphis pumps from here. This is the city of Memphis. This is the Mississippi River. So they pump from here, and they also pump from the Fort Pillow sand. Okay. So what are the issues? Okay. We know that Memphis essentially is right on the state line. Its southern boundary essentially is the state line between Tennessee and Mississippi. Okay. And actually that part of Mississippi, northwestern Mississippi, DeSoto County, which is the home of Jerry Lee Lewis now, those of you interested in that, is rapidly growing. It's essentially a bedroom community or suburb for Memphis. So it's Memphis's growth that is fueling the growth in DeSoto County. So they're using more groundwater in DeSoto County. And a number of years ago, Mississippi noted that it seems like the water levels were dropping faster than they thought in the wells in DeSoto County. So who was causing that? Well, he just looked up to their neighbor to the north. And Mississippi said, my God, these guys are pumping 24 million gallons of water per day of our water coming from beneath Mississippi. And they estimate that it's been 365 billion gallons since 1965. And in fact, if you go to the Mississippi, I think it's Environmental Protection, they actually list Memphis as the largest user of Mississippi groundwater, even though Memphis has no wells in Mississippi. And these are the 10 areas. These are called well fields. Okay, here's the state line right here. And in these well fields, these are clusters of wells that tap into the Memphis sand and pump water out. They're obviously all in Mississippi, all on land owned by the city of Memphis. That's an important, that'll show up later. This, which is supposed to be yellow, but it's kind of this horrible green, this is the area of influence. This is the region where the pumping has affected the water levels. And you'll note that it extends into Mississippi. And this is what Mississippi is fussing about. There are 10 of these well fields. I believe another one has come online since this paper was written. But this is what has gotten people in Mississippi upset. And this map here, this shows it sort of graphically. This is a map view. Again, here's the state line. This is Memphis, this kind of pinkish area, or whatever it shows like on the screen. Now, these lines here, imagine this like being a topographic map. You've all seen topographic maps, okay? And they have the contour lines on them. Shows the elevation. What these lines show, these show the elevation of the water levels in the Memphis sand aquifer. And they generally are higher in this area, and they decrease as we go west to the Mississippi River. And what that means is, just like if you roll a ball, you know, put it on top of a hill, it'll roll down the hill. Same thing will happen here. The water tends to flow where the water levels are higher to where the water levels are lower. And what has happened is the pumping from Memphis, and remember, they've been doing this since 1924, although the amounts have dramatically increased in the last 30 years, they have changed this natural distribution of these lines such that water is now being sucked up from Mississippi. Now, Memphis does not deny this. They say, yeah, so what's the deal? I mean, what's the problem? Okay, there's even a little bit of water taken from Arkansas. Well, Arkansas doesn't care. Okay, they have other issues to deal with, Walmart and a few other things. Now, this is another map. This is an interesting map. Again, this is Shelby County, this is Tennessee, this is Mississippi, DeSoto County. This is actually a representation of what the surface of the water level in the Memphis sand looks like. And you'll notice that there are depressed areas here, and these are where the highest concentration of pumping is, and it's sucking down the water level, in some cases maybe hundreds of feet. Okay? So this very graphically illustrates what Mississippi has to deal with. Okay? DeSoto County is being affected. So, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Mississippi, which are the major states that overlie the Memphis sand aquifer, they had actually been in discussion about how to allocate this water among the three states. Mississippi abruptly pulled out of these discussions. I think they were having discussions about having discussions. You know, it was one of those things. Probably arguing about the shape of the table or something like that. But anyway, what they did was Mississippi in 2005 filed a lawsuit against the city of Memphis and its subsidiary. And they sought over $1 billion in damages, claiming that water had been stolen from them, and they figured it was worth, I think it was like $1.3 billion or something. It was a lot of money, okay, because Memphis would have to fork this over. And another problem that would be that if Memphis had lost this suit, they would have to curtail some of their pumping. Fortunately, they're on the Mississippi River. Unfortunately, they would have to spend $300 million to build a water treatment plant because the Mississippi water is crappy. You know, it's the old adage, in St. Louis, flush twice, it's a long way to Memphis. Okay, so they would have to spend $300 million to build a plant, and then like maybe $20 or $30 million a year operation and maintenance. The Memphis sand aquifer water does not require any treatment except you add chlorine. Okay, you disinfect it. It's great water. Okay, so they filed a suit. Took 3 years to finally go to trial in the U.S. District Court in Oxford, Mississippi, and Judge Glenn Davidson dispensed with it in a couple of days, saying that, listen, you need to also bring Tennessee into the suit because they're a defendant, because Memphis is a political subdivision of Tennessee. Tennessee allocates water, just like all states do, so Tennessee has a stake in this because you're essentially criticizing their water law. So he said, and since that needs to be done, it then becomes a state versus state issue, and you got to go to the Supreme Court. So I'm out of here. So what they did was, like any good lawyer, they said, well, we're going to appeal this to the Fifth Circuit Court in New Orleans. And the Fifth Circuit Court in New Orleans upheld the district court's ruling. They essentially said that to exclude Tennessee would be enormously prejudicial to Tennessee. And then they also went ahead and they said, look, since this aquifer is an interstate resource, you don't have a claim until the water has been allocated among the three states, and then if it turns out that, say, Tennessee or Memphis is taking more than its allocation, then you have a case. You know, Mississippi didn't want to hear that, but that's the way it went. So they also said that, you know, the aquifer is like a lake or a reservoir that borders multiple states. You have to decide who gets what. So anyway, Mississippi, their contention was, number one, that when they became a state in 1817, the federal government allocated all the waters within its boundaries to them, to the state. And Memphis was stealing some of that water. They also said that, look, we're going to invoke the public trust doctrine. We're the steward of this groundwater resource for the people of Mississippi, for the benefit of the people of Mississippi. And Tennessee is not abiding by that. So anyway, they decided to take it to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court decided, we don't want to hear this. They didn't even bother with it. And essentially the subtext from some of the attorneys that I spoke with was that the Supreme Court, they didn't feel that Mississippi had made the case that they had been damaged at all. But they left it open. They just denied the motion without prejudice, meaning that if Mississippi at some point feels they have a better case about having been damaged, that they can bring it back to the Supreme Court. Now, what was interesting, these are some of my observations. I already talked about the discussion among the three states. The third bullet, the public trust doctrine, and Joe is much better to speak to this than I am, does it apply to groundwater? It's been applied to surface water, other natural resources, but does it apply to groundwater? That's an issue. The institutional asymmetry is interesting. Do we need to start thinking about this in terms of developing ways to manage conflict? Okay. Another thing that the courts have noted, it's hard to prove that groundwater is being diverted or, in the case of Mississippi, stolen. Sure, I put these maps up here that show the water flowing in there, but surface water is different. You can see a head gate, you can see a pipe in the water or something, but groundwater is a lot trickier. The other interesting aspect is, does Memphis have the right to actually pump this much groundwater? And there was a report written in 2000 by the University of Tennessee saying that they weren't really sure that Memphis had the right to pump the groundwater. Tennessee is a land ownership state. If you own the land, you own the water beneath it. But there's a reasonable use component to it. Now, Mississippi also is what's called a reasonable use state with respect to groundwater, but it's different. The state owns the groundwater, and that was the basis for their public trust application. But in Tennessee, if you own the land, you pump the ground, and you can pump the groundwater. The problem is Memphis owns the land where the groundwater is pumped, but it's distributed throughout the city and in Shelby County to land that the city does not own. So this is a gray area, and I'm surprised no one has pushed this a little bit further. And according to the state of Tennessee, no one has legally challenged the city of Memphis's right to do this since 1924. And I say a legal challenge. I'm sure some people have claimed. So that's an interesting aspect. Now, implications for management. You know, what's the difference between ownership and use? Okay. This is a transboundary groundwater dispute, but it doesn't involve two states. It involves a state and a city. Tennessee really, I don't think, wanted to be brought into this suit, but they were forced to. What's the value of groundwater and possible groundwater marketing? The fourth bullet, again, is important. The public trust. Does it apply to groundwater? And I think we need compacts and institutions designed specifically for transboundary groundwater. Now, there are some interstate model compacts that exist. The ones that I'm familiar with don't really treat groundwater too well unless it's really connected to a river. But in this case, there's no surface water issue here, and there's no water quality issue. It's just groundwater. Okay? Last thing, Gabriel Eckstein, a friend of mine who's a water lawyer at Texas Wesleyan University, as he points out, is the neglected stepchild of water law, groundwater. That's true, and that's true internationally as well. And Alan Cameron, who I've cited a lot, who was the Mississippi lawyer in the Supreme Court, said hydrogeology and law are still not wholly integrated. Now, that's no unusual thing to me, because in my travels and in my talks, a lot of people, and it's not just lawyers, engineers and scientists don't understand groundwater and the different aspects of groundwater relative to surface water. Okay, it's amazing. There are a lot of people who should know better, and they don't. And the problem is they're making decisions. So what I think this will do, right here is bottom, is going to provide the impetus for transboundary aquifer riparians to develop joint management plans and maybe have regional commissions or interstate commissions, much like the Delaware River Basin Commission, which, to my way of thinking, I don't know how you feel about it, is probably one of the better interstate commissions. But again, they deal with surface water. They deal with groundwater because it's related to surface water. But anyway, so what I think is going to happen is that I think the 3 states are going to get together, and in fact, according to some people who don't want to be quoted, they are talking now, because I don't think they want to go to court. Certainly Memphis doesn't, and I don't think Mississippi can prove damages, but they're probably getting together to talk about how we should allocate this water and then set up some commission or board to make sure that everybody plays by the rules. But what is fascinating about this is it's a water quantity issue in a very wet region of the United States, which is unusual. Now, we're seeing that in the southeast with Georgia, Alabama, and Florida fussing over the Apalachicola, Chattahoochee, Flint Basin. But you don't think of water quantity issues as being problems in the east. We also see the Great Lakes now. It seems to be endemic mainly to the west where we don't have much water. But in this area, we get 55 inches of water, and they're fighting over water that you can't see. So these are the references, and thank you. Obviously, this is not the southeast. Those are not the Memphis hills in the background, but I cropped out the bottom. Well, this is, I'm sure since we're in the west, you've all seen this postcard. It's probably hanging on everybody's door. Okay, discussing water rights, a Western pastime. That's what the bottom should say. So anyway, thanks very much. Appreciate it. You better do it, yeah, because I'll...
Thank you very much, Dr. Campana. Our third panelist is Madeline Greymountain, a member of the Tribal Council for the Confederated Tribes of the Goshute Indian Reservation, which governs the reservation and manages the tribal government. Councilwoman Greymountain will provide us with an indigenous perspective informed by hundreds of years of cultural traditions in the Great Basin, now threatened by transboundary groundwater pipeline proposal that we've heard about from Maud Barlow and Simeon Hertzkovitz, as well as others throughout the conference. It is my honor to introduce and offer a very warm welcome to Councilwoman Madeline Greymountain.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Madeline Greymountain, and I'm a representative of the Confederated Tribes of the Goshute Reservation. From what I understand, I'm supposed to be a politician, but I'm not. I'm a representative. I feel privileged to be here today, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. I just want to share a little bit about myself before I delve into my reason for being here. I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of our people and how I tie into all of that. These mountains are what I woke up to every day for the early years of my life living with my grandparents on the reservation, and this is where many who still reside on the reservation call home and enjoy living it every day. I was delivered into this world by my great-grandmother back in the 60s on the reservation I represent now. I didn't even have a birth certificate until I was 17 years old. She lived to be almost 100 years old and practiced her traditional ways throughout her entire life, as many of our people do today. She knew of and used wild plants for medicine and healing. She spoke only our traditional language, but her teachings were clear and strong, leading by example. Pictured here is my Dhoti. She's my great-grandmother. She's the one that's on the left. And my Gagu, who is my grandmother, who is her youngest daughter my Dhoti's on the right, my Gagu's on the left. Our people hunt deer, elk, antelope, rabbits, pheasants, rockchucks, and other wildlife generationally. These animals rely on the supply of water in our springs, ponds, and streams. Springs, ponds, and streams. I say that 10 times. I was told my Doti hunted with just a rifle and a horse in her spry years, which is something I can't imagine myself doing. I was told a lot of stories about her, and I think she was an incredible woman. Our people still gather, cook, and store wild plant food, such as choke cherries, elderberries, wild onions, watercress, wild mint leaves, pine nuts, and the like. These traditional foods kept our people healthy. And long ago, when this is all that they ate, they didn't have much need for medical attention. They kept physical and, of course, drank lots of water. So they didn't have the illnesses that we have today, such as diabetes and cancer and all of these other things that are in our bodies now. Water also had other uses, such as tanning deer hides, making willow supple for cradleboard making, and basketry. Just to mention a few examples of cultural use, I believe, Gavin, we played something during the recess earlier, and it showed some of that basketry. We also receive spiritual help through our cedar and sage. You will find cedar and sage in every one of our homes. Water is used in our ceremonies. Our prayers begin and end with water. Water is not just water to our people. Our water is for healing, spirituality, and cleansing of the body and soul. Our people live through the water as the water lives through us. As we all know, what does our doctor say to us when we get sick? Drink lots of water, right? So, clean water. Our reservation is located in an oasis in the valley and foothills of the Deep Creek Mountains in White Pine County, Nevada, as well as Joab and Twilla counties in Utah. You'll see here, hey, that does come out good, huh? Well, it's somewhere in here. I don't think you can see it very well. Let's see. The reservation covers approximately 113,000 acres of land located between about 70 miles southeast of Wendover, straddling the Utah-Nevada border. Many times we get confused with the Scow Valley Band of Goshutes, who are our sister tribe, but we are separate governments. They are located northeast of the Dugway Proving Grounds. I think you can see this one better. They are right here. You can see from this map the location of the two Goshute tribes. In addition to drinking water, domestic and agricultural use. We currently use our water for our Bonneville Cutthroat Trout Fishery. Interestingly, the tribe maintains a fishery that propagate the only pure strains of Bonneville Cutthroat trout and basically save the species from extinction. Further additional use include an orchard and crop irrigation, horse and livestock watering, and it is home to migratory birds, and it sustains all wildlife and plants. We have future proposed water uses still under construction and several agricultural projects on the horizon. Since time immemorial, the Goshute, Shoshone, and Paiute have inhabited and used our Aboriginal lands in the Great Basin. This map includes the Ute and Navajo. The Confederated Tribes of the Goshute Reservation has partnered with the Round River Conservation Studies to assist the tribe in protecting its interests on and off the reservation through cultural mapping, such as this map. Scientific studies and reports aimed at strengthening the position of the tribe in all land issues. The long-term goal of this project is to exert and defend our rights and interests across our ancestral lands to maintain our access to clean water, public lands, natural resources, and protect our cultural antiquities. The Indian tribes have sovereign rights secured under Indian treaties and agreements with the United States and all other rights and benefits to which we are entitled under the laws and Constitution of the United States. In keeping our sovereignty in practice, we want to enlighten the public toward a better understanding of our Indian people, to preserve our Indian culture and traditional values, and to promote the health, safety, and welfare of our Indian people. My talk today will focus on our opposition with groundwater pumping from the surrounding areas that will affect the reservation's underground water reserve. The Southern Nevada Water Authority has received approval from the Nevada State Water Engineer for a number of groundwater rights applications in the areas surrounding the reservation, with the intention of pumping as much water as they can to Las Vegas to support continued urban and suburban growth in that area. The area in the red, can you see that? Okay, that area in the red right there indicates the Southern Nevada Water Authority's water grab area. The dark area is our ancestral lands. It looks like a duck head is what I told Gavin one time. When you see from this map the growth of Las Vegas from 1973 to 2006, Southern Nevada Water Authority began their plans more than 30 years ago, then sprang into aggressive action a few years ago when our chairman, Rupert Still, at that time became aware of it. He proactively became engaged. From this picture, you can see the rapid growth under a period of time and why they have acquired a great thirst. We consider our reservation the epicenter of this great undertaking, and the Southern Nevada Water Authority wants us to believe our aquifer surely ends at the reservation boundary and this pipeline will not affect us. You know, it's pretty, when you see this map here, our reservation is right here. The studies go to the west, east, and south of our reservation. We were not included in any of those studies. It would have been at our own cost, and we don't have the finances to take care of that kind of studies. We're still working on that. And so the red on this map indicates the pipeline that will extend from our area carrying our precious water to Las Vegas, which is this line right here. This is the line that will carry our water. Also note the boundary of the area to the west, south, and east of our reservation, which I just pointed out to you. The Great Basin Aquifer is really a system of many dozens of poorly studied groundwater basins interconnected through fissures and underground flows deep in the carbonate rock layer that stretch from Salt Lake City to California. Underground flows toward the Great Salt Lake will reverse course with effects that will not be known until the pumps are ignited, some experts say and tell us. And I believe that. Federal agencies such as the BIA and BLM have trust responsibility to protect Indian tribes and tribal resources. Yet instead of working to safeguard the rights of tribes, these, among other agencies, have joined forces with the Southern Nevada Water Authority to do everything possible to ensure that this pipeline gets built. And our tribe has stood strong opposition with this, and we will continue to stand our ground. The Southern Nevada Water Authority's pending applications and groundwater development proposal would threaten all supposedly available groundwater in our area. I say supposedly due to the fact that there are no conclusive studies to support adequate groundwater to afford the piping to Las Vegas. We have attempted to get adequate hydrological studies done on the reservation, but no finances make this difficult, although some studies conducted off reservation still resulted in no real conclusion. I'm going to skip this part that I was going to talk about a little bit about the Colorado River, but I believe some of the other presentations already covered that, so we'll skip this. At the same time, we are also pleading our case to the Nevada and Utah state offices and representatives, which include state engineers, the governors, state Senate members, legislature, and so on, to keep the pressure on our strong stand of opposition. The Nevada legislature currently is proposing changes to the Nevada water law and drafting new bills to revise this law. However, the proposed bills weigh in favor of Southern Nevada Water Authority. This part, I'll just show you the picture on this. I had some stuff to say on this, but I think it's repetitious of the upcoming. Our Aboriginal lands overlap the areas of concern and have nothing to do with the reservation boundary. Our people roamed and lived throughout the Great Basin regions in Utah and Nevada since before laws and boundary. The land and water comprising these Aboriginal lands have been central to the culture and religion of the Great Basin tribes and have purposefully lived in harmony with the plants and animals of our Aboriginal lands in a delicate, natural, and spiritual balance. We need to ask ourselves, which I've already heard this in the presentations prior to this, is water a commodity or is it a right? The Southern Nevada Water Authority project impact area affects the ancestral lands of 5 other federally recognized tribes in addition to ours, which are the Ely Shoshone, Duckwater Shoshone, Paiute tribes of Utah, Scott Valley Band of Goshutes, and the Timoke tribe of Western Shoshone. Imagine, if you will, 306 miles of buried pipeline at 16 to 84 inches in diameter to pipe our region's water south. This is actually a picture, an example of the pipe above ground, but this will actually be buried. This would be at a cost of $3.5 to $6 billion. Who pays for this? I don't know. We know from long-standing practical experience, if you'll notice from this picture, this is about the size of the pipe that's going to be under the ground. We know from long-standing practice experience in this region that Southern Nevada Water Authority's proposed groundwater pumping and export would lower the groundwater table of our Aboriginal lands, will result in harmful impacts to our environment that will be irreversible and detrimental to all life. Dry up the springs and wells that sustain the entire ecology and economy of these lands. The groundwater is almost and only and by far the most essential water supply available to the tribes, farmers, hunters, ranchers, and all residents of the neighboring communities within the Great Basin. Severely and irreparably harm the human, animal, and plant communities of this region. And I believe there was another presentation that talked about climate change, so I'm not going to go too far into that either. Then there's the threat of air quality after the devastating effects of no water to sustain vegetation and ground moisture. An example of this is the Owens Valley catastrophe resulting from removal of large amounts of water from the rural desert areas to fuel explosive growth in a distant city. In the 1980s, Owens Valley became the single worst source of particulate pollution in the nation, registering at 23 times the level allowed by federal health standards. Now, this is what threatens our area. And so there's a picture of a dust storm that is in the valley of Owens Valley. I have some more things to talk about, but due to time constraint, I'm just going to skip through these ones. These are pictures of Owens Valley and the devastation that followed the pumping. And this is a news clipping of a dust storm in Owens Valley. We anticipate similar consequences should water be pumped from our area. We anticipate that many streams, springs, and ponds will run dry, that well water levels will drop, and that increased dust storms will plague the Great Basin, including the Wasatch Front. Other factors that impact or impede our well-being include insurmountable costs in attorney fees and associated legal costs, great efforts, time, and energy expended towards this cause, failed economic development endeavors, thus losing prospective sustainable revenue for our tribe. An example of this is our failed alternative energy projects and a wasteful government spending from our standpoint. We recognize the immensity of the challenge before us, as well as the fact that additional expertise, tools, and partnerships will be needed to maintain and prevail in our fight to protect our natural resources. We will continue to raise more money and seek out additional funding sources to keep up with the surmounting costs to protect our homeland, natural resources, and culture. We encourage interest in the general public, special interest groups, formulation of new coalitions, and so on to assist us in our initiative. Increased use of technology such as websites to keep people informed and up to date on progress. A lot of our people don't have that kind of expertise, so we need to reach out for that. Southern Nevada Water Authority has bought out substantial land from private owners, but we want the public to understand we are here for the long haul in this fight for our water rights. We can't just simply sell our land and walk away so that Las Vegas can buy it. They can't purchase our land. We're going to be here for. Looks like my time is up. So. Oh.
No, I'm sorry.
I was on a momentum. The Supreme Court held that when Indian reservations were established, the tribes in the United States implicitly reserved along the land sufficient water to fulfill the purposes of the reservations. Federal Indian water rights are defined and governed by a body of federal law that recognizes that Indian tribes have unique property and sovereignty rights in the water on our reservations. Because Indian reservations were established before most water uses began in the West, tribes often hold the oldest and thus most valuable water rights, known as Aboriginal water rights, since Indians have occupied land since time immemorial. On the next few frames, please take note of the special rock formations in and around the reservation. These all hold special meanings to us. We are stewards of these lands, and our people, once occupied, still occupy, and will remain occupied upon. So we need to take the steps necessary to defend our fullest capacity, our land, water, air, and animals that nurture the roots of our Goshute culture. Do you guys know what this is? You guys don't see a lizard right there? Another one right there? As tribal leaders, we think about the future of our people. We think about the decisions we make now and how will it benefit and protect our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. We must protect our sovereignty and understand its impact upon our land, people, and resources. Here's another land formation. I'm not sure if you already figured that one out. I want to acknowledge and thank some support networks for their most appreciated efforts in our endeavors. The Great Basin Water Network has taught us a lot, and we appreciate them. The Utah and Nevada tribes have supported us, and we appreciate that. The Round River Conservation Studies is continually working with us right now to assist us with the cultural mapping and some other issues and initiatives that are coming up, because we don't just deal with this issue, we deal with the whole gob of issues tribally. And so in the National Congress of American Indians, I also want to thank the Utah Division of Indian Affairs, Forrest Kutch. Thank you, my friend. I appreciate everything that you've done for us. You've been great to work with, and I'm saddened to hear that you've been let go from office. And truly, I will miss you. Various funding sources as well. Some of those funding sources did not want their name to be released here, so I'll keep that confidential for them. And in this picture, do you guys see that? That's pretty prominent, right? Water is an essential part of our lives. From the moment we are born to the last day of our life, we have great respect for the power of water and use it resourcefully, respectfully, and guardedly. We, the Goshute people, understand our land and its natural resources the best. We are the experts, and we are working to preserve it. This is our former chairman, Rupert Steele. This is one of the elders of our tribe. She was professional basket maker. I mean, she was recognized for it nationally. Every living body and organism needs water for survival. Most of my presentation was from a tribal point of view, but I want each of you to think in terms of generations after you that this may impact, especially if you live in or near the Great Basin area. Power, money, and politics are pressuring us to sacrifice our environment so that Las Vegas can prosper. Please keep that in your mind. Here are several ways that you can help our tribe in the Great Basin water grab. I want to thank you for your attention. And it's been a tumultuous journey for the tribe, but we are warriors, and we will keep moving forward. I promise.
Well, a big thank you to all of our panelists for our final panel session. And now we have roughly a half an hour for an opportunity to interact among one another, discuss some of the lessons we've learned. And we'll initiate that discussion with some questions and answers for our panelists, and then we'll see if we can synthesize some of the themes and possible sustainable ways to move forward for positive water futures.
Okay. I just like to know where the Owens Valley is.
It's in California. Is this on?
Yes. Ladon?
It's in California. I believe it is north of Los Angeles. Terry Morosco actually has quite a bit of information on it. I brought it to my awareness when I first got engaged with this
This is something that has become near and dear to me now. Our opposition with Southern Nevada Water Authority. On Owens Valley, I just recently started reading on it, but it is devastating. The information I have on it is quite expansive. But if you go online and you Google on Owens Valley, it'll take you to the direct information. It's really quite a bit. Actually, Terry wants to speak on that.
Irony of Owens Valley. The city of Los Angeles had to pay $700 million to mitigate the Owens Valley. And one of the pictures that Madeline had shown was irrigation lines going over the dry lake bed. They now have to water the dry lake to keep the dust down. The cost of the restoration of the Owens River is another $65 million. So if you look into the future and you think about the Great Basin issues, somebody's going to have to pay for something for a long time to come if it's devastated.
And before we move on, I wanted to call to your attention that there's a cultural interest map for the Goshute tribe in the back of the Confederated Tribes of the Goshute in the back of the room. And Gavin, where are you? Has some additional resource information in the back as well. So please take a look at that before you leave. LaDawn?
Thank you. The Owens Valley is between the Sierra Nevada and the Nevada border, so in California, but on the eastern side of the Sierras. This was very interesting. Thank you very much. I'm wondering if, first of all, Madeline, if you could say whether your tribe has been following the Arizona tribes, especially the Gila River area, and their victories over water rights, and whether that has any lessons or leverage that you've been able to use. And then any of the panelists, if you could talk about whether international law, and especially in terms of indigenous rights, might have any bearing on this case, or on, well, maybe not so much the Mississippi case, but perhaps on the case in Israel and Palestine.
I will answer the first question. I only got some fleeting information on that. I haven't been able to get my feet wet yet, but now that you've brought it to my attention, I sure will.
Actually, if I had that extra 2 hours, I would have answered your question. As I had more slides on customary international law relating to water and how it might be relevant to the situation in the Jordan Dead Sea Valley. And we have replaced the Helsinki Rules, which is, for many years, was accepted as the standard summary of customary international law of water resources. International Law Association, which is a private association, did approve in 2004 the Berlin Rules on water resources, for which I was a rapporteur, which is a fancy way of saying I wrote it. And so naturally, I think it's pretty good. And if you are interested in a relatively succinct summary of the customary international law of water resources, I recommend that you Google the Berlin Rules and see what it says. Now, the customary law, customary law by itself doesn't solve problems. It gives you certain guidelines, and it enables certain arguments to be made. It rules out of bounds certain other arguments. But it doesn't ultimately decide who gets how much water for what purposes. Ultimately, that has to be negotiated. The Israelis, as I've indicated, pretty much control what water the Palestinians get. Now, they've been increasing the amount of water that they allow the Palestinians to have under a series of agreements made in the 90s. But they want to remain in control. They're not so much against giving the Palestinians even more water, but they are against a situation where the Palestinians would be independent of their control on water. There are many, many complexities, but one of the very interesting things is I worked as a consultant to Palestinian and Israeli water managers throughout the 90s who were negotiating the agreements, which, among other things, increased the amount of water available to Palestinians. And one of the things I quickly realized is that the people in that region, the Israelis, Jordanians, Palestinians, to list them alphabetically, see water as a practical problem. They don't see it as what I would call an ideological problem. It's not a question of God gave me this land or this is my holy city. And since they see it as a practical problem, they see it as having practical solutions. And when they get together to talk about water, and I mentioned before, there's been a lot of cooperation, in fact, much of it covert, in recent years overt, on water. But when they get together to talk about water, they talk rationally about, well, what will work? And what do you really need? And what can we give up? They don't dig their feet in and say, you know, God gave this to me and I'm not talking about it, which is what they do when you talk about Jerusalem, when you talk about land, when you talk about this right of return of the Palestinians. There they just don't want to reach agreement, although WikiLeaks told us they're a lot closer to agreement in private than we knew. But when those things become public, they have to be disavowed because those are seen, as I said, as ideological problems. As long as they see water as a practical problem, it's something they can deal with.
Interesting. Other questions?
Yes, hi, a couple of questions, please. I'll direct this to Mr. Campana, but invite anyone to comment on it. My question is somewhat idealized, assuming that we have a utopian society when I ask this question. Can and should our water issues be decided in the courts as they are now, or can they better be decided out of a courtroom setting, whether that's heads of state with boxing gloves in the town square or some other non-court method? And part two of my question, Mr. Campana, you told us some of the complexities of the water law there in Tennessee and Mississippi, and I couldn't help but note how it differs from Utah law. Would we have a better society, a more utopian society, if all water laws were standardized throughout the nation? I realize it's unlikely to ever happen, but would it improve the system?
With respect to your first question, I'm probably not a good person to answer that because I'm not a lawyer, but I will answer it because I think you're right. One of the things that irks me about certain cases is that they're decided by people who don't have the expertise in the area. And this case is very complex. And again, I can't comment on, I'm not an attorney, I wasn't privy to what the Supreme Court was thinking, but I think they kind of shied away from this and dropped the ball. In fact, I know a number of attorney friends of mine who deal with, specifically with groundwater, were hoping the Supreme Court would hear this and rule on it because the Supreme Court has never done this with respect to groundwater, entirely a groundwater case. And actually, in response to LaDawn's question, this would actually, but to reverse it, this would have actually probably had international implications because I didn't realize, but when I was speaking to Gabriel Eckstein, a colleague of mine, he said, you know, foreign courts and, commissions often look to the U.S. Supreme Court and, like I say, well, what did the U.S. Supreme Court think about this? And there were actually some foreign people who were cognizant of this case and were hoping that the Supreme Court would do something about it. I've heard I would have hoped, and I hope now, that the three states are getting together. Sometimes the threat of litigation is gets people talking. This, of course, went very far. But excuse me, I think that, and I suspect this is what's going to happen, the three states are going to get together and decide how to allocate the water, and that's who should do it. It should be the states themselves. And there have been some novel applications of resolving issues involving water without going through the courts. And one of the ones that I was almost involved in about 10 years ago was two parties litigating each other over groundwater contamination. And instead of going to, suing one another, what they decided to do was to present their cases before a three-person panel. One, the chair of the panel was a retired federal judge, and then the other two were experts in that particular field, and each litigant chose one expert. And they signed a binding agreement to not to sue each other, and would accept the resolution or the decision of this panel. And I thought that was a great way to do things. So, I mean, I think obviously the courts have their case, but I could give you some ugly examples of where the judge misunderstood the nature of the case involving groundwater, and it led to some, it led to some difficulties. And I'm sure Joe can do the same. And your second question, I mean, a uniform water law.
Well, that's
I mean,
what I've been working on.
First of all, there's a reason why we have prior appropriation in the West, because it's very dry, and prior appropriation is a law. You can trace it back to North Africa, the Moors, etc., designed for water-short areas, because it provides certainty in terms of, if I'm going to invest in irrigation works or hydro facilities or something, I need to have certainty that I'll have access to the water. And in the East, it's essentially riparian law with some exceptions or modifications, because, they had a lot of surface water. So if you lived on a stream, you had a right to use so much water, et cetera. So I'm not sure that one size fits all works. I'm not, thrilled with prior appropriation, but we've got it. We've got to live with it. It's not going away, not in my lifetime, for sure. Maybe some of the younger people here. So I'm not sure that a uniform water law would work.
Yeah, let me say the real when you're talking about interstate disputes, the real function of a court case is to prod the states to negotiate seriously. So all too often they won't. And I think you saw an example of that in Memphis and Tennessee and Arkansas, not negotiating seriously. You have a court that's actually made a decision or threatening a decision, that does tend to wake people up. One result is Delaware River Basin Commission that Mike spoke about during his talk, which many people think is an excellent example of cooperative interstate water management. That was because they'd had, over the years, a series of Supreme Court decisions that the state governments were increasingly unhappy with. And so they finally said, well, look, we can't continue to let the Supreme Court decide how much water New York City gets, how much water Trenton, New Jersey gets, et cetera, et cetera. We've got to take this into our own hands. And so they negotiated the Delaware River Basin Compact that set up what, as I say, is a very good interstate management model. Not perfect, but good. Secondly, regarding the possibility of uniform state laws, if you recall the opening slide of my presentation, it indicated I'm director of the Model Water Code Project, the American Society of Civil Engineers. I'm not an engineer, although I have several awards from ASCE on my wall for my work on water law with them. And the plan was, the engineers thought, well, our lives at least would be a lot simpler if all the states had the same water law. And I didn't originally start as director. Ray J. Davis, who used to teach water law at Brigham Young, was the founder, but when he retired, he asked me to take over. And one of the things we decided is you couldn't do one model water code. You had to do two, one for the East, one for the West. And doing the one for the East was relatively easy, because there were not all, this brought together, by the way, engineers, economists, water managers, lawyers, all in this big body to draft this model code. And in the East, there was not a lot of hard and fast water law, and so it was fairly easy to get people to accept, and the Westerners participating didn't care, on a model code for the East. And it's had some influence in the East. No state legislature has enacted it in whole, but bits and pieces of it have been picked up. In the West, when we turn to the appropriative rights model water code in the West, every member of the group who was from a Western state dug in his heels and said, whenever we proposed a provision that we thought was, because the goal was to put together a model code that takes what we thought as a group were the best examples from all the different states. Whenever we proposed something that was different from what my state does, everyone in the room except the one person from the state, or 2-3 people from the state where that model came from, immediately said, that's not right. It's not the way the law is or should be. It was extremely difficult. And that process is not yet complete. To get the Westerners to agree on what a model law should look like. They all thought it should look like just like my state's law and nothing else. So it's not easy.
But it's a nice thought. I mean, but
Thank you for that question. Simeon, you had a question, and then the gentleman behind you in the red T-shirt after that.
Yeah, I have a quick question, I think, for Professor Dellapenna. Towards the end, when you were talking about the Red Dead or Dead Red project,
Red Dead, yeah.
You indicated that it really wasn't truly intended to provide any water for the Dead Sea.
As it turns out.
And I have a question, which is there any genuine interest or intent on the part of the three groups of people, the three national entities, if you will, to actually try and do something to conserve water for the Dead Sea or do something to keep it as a usable resource and keep it maybe, I don't know, in its current state or improve its state of health?
Let's just say that my work in this project, I did not find any evidence of such an intent. If you're not involved in it directly in the project, this is often what the PR says. We're going to save the Dead Sea. But in my work, I haven't found much evidence of any intent to actually do that. The real intent is to use the water as a new source of fresh water through desalination. Most of it to Jordan, a good deal of it to the Palestinians. Israelis are very happy for the Palestinians to get water from that source because that, from their point of view, it means we have to give up less. And the Palestinians, in one sense, are looking forward to it because they hope this will be water that isn't under Israeli control. And as I said, the Israelis have indicated they want to take a very token amount of water, desalinated water, from the project simply to make sure that they always have a seat at the table when decisions are being made, because they do not want themselves to become dependent on a water facility, the bulk of which will be physically located in Jordan.
Greymountain, what, if any, assistance is the Bureau of Indian Affairs providing your group in your troubling quest?
Well, I'll finish the rest of that one then. In the get-go, when I got involved with all of this, it came to our attention that the Bureau of Indian Affairs and BLM, they are supposed to serve a certain trust responsibility to the Indian tribes, but we have witnessed intentionally withheld key information about the proposed project. They have failed to consult with the tribes as required by law. They misled us about potential impacts, and they collaborated on attempts to get tribes to sign documents that would remove our right to contest this project. So, but since that time, since we brought it to their awareness, they have since begun to cooperate. So that's the good news of that. We're going to keep pressure on them as well, too. So.
Thank you. Question in the back.
Much of what has been said here seems to lie in the arenas of science and the law being solutions to water problems. And then comes before us Madeline, who represents a minority. And I wonder, to what extent do you think there is for her in the combination of science and the law a solution to the problems that she represents as a minority group?
Who do you put that question to?
Madeline, do you want to take a crack at that first?
I could tell you how I'd see it. You know, some people may not be happy with that answer, but I think more people need to recognize a sovereign nation's rights and that we are a government, and they need to recognize that fact. There's a lot of struggle with that from within the governments as it is. But like I said up there, I'm not a politician. I truly am a representative of what's best for our people. And that's what our politicians should be doing on the Hill as well. What is best for all of our people. So I don't know if that takes care of your answer or not. And I don't know what the fix is, to tell the truth, because sometimes I feel like that's out of our control.
I would throw in my 2 cents. I'm a little bit biased. I worked in Nevada for 13 years at the Desert Research Institute, and I did a fair amount of work on the groundwater systems that Madeline is talking about, and that Southern Nevada Water Authority, which now I learned has the nice acronym of SINWA, is attempting to tap. And it's amazing what happens when you leave a state. When you're in a state and you're talking about this, no one pays attention to you. As soon as I left Nevada for New Mexico, the phone was ringing off the hook about, hey, what about the work you did 20 years ago? And it's like, I can't remember 20 years ago. But anyway, so I'm perhaps a little bit biased, but I think that obviously one thing that, if you look at the root of this, I mean, this is looking at water as a commodity. I mean, that's what Las Vegas or Sinwa is looking at. And again, having been a longtime Nevada resident, Las Vegas, this may offend some people, is the economic engine of Nevada, at least Nevada as it exists today. You take Las Vegas away with the gaming revenues, the state would be, again, a lot of people, particularly I was in Reno, we would have liked the state a lot better. But Nevada, I mean, Las Vegas runs the show because of money. So this is, to me, it looks like a case where, okay, we're going to be piping water for some rural valleys where there are a couple of farmers, and there's some springs, and maybe it might impact Utah, and it might impact some Native Americans, but look, we're 2-point-some million people. We're the power in the state, and I think it's a failure to recognize that water is more than a commodity, but it has very profound cultural and social significance to people that maybe you don't think count for much, but actually they do count. They count every bit as much as you do. So that's my admittedly biased opinion.
Well, I sometimes say that when you're talking about water, people divide into 2 groups. Those who think that water is a commodity or resource just like any other, and then there's the rest of us. Because it's not just like a resource just like any other. When I was in Turkey once, somebody said, well, the Iraqis have their oil. Most of the water in the Tigris and Euphrates, about 98% of it comes from rain and snow in Turkey. And so the position some Turks are taking, this should be our water, we should be able to cut off all the water to Iraq. Iraq is a desert. Without the rivers, it literally is nothing there. So what do you say? They've got oil. We've got water. Why shouldn't we be able to hold on to the water? Well, I remind people that oil is not like water in lots of ways, but one of the most important things is you can only use it once. Water is used and reused. On an average day, the Schuylkill River, which is a small river in Pennsylvania, about 7 times as much water is taken out of the river as is flowing in the river. Now, how do you do that? Well, because it's used over and over again. And so, I mean, that's fundamentally different. It has an inherently public nature, or common nature, or however you want to describe that. And that's fundamentally different. So that's one point. Now, in terms of law, law is not a panacea. It doesn't solve every problem. It often doesn't solve any. Often doesn't give you a final solution to a problem, even though you've got what lawyers like to look at as, this is the decision of the Supreme Court, and that's the end of it. Well, it's not the end of it. I already mentioned how the Delaware River Basin Commission, and, the states ended up replacing the decision of the Supreme Court to a large extent, not completely. In Nevada, there's a decision made many years ago called Cape Park case. This was There's a national monument in the desert and has some caves, I believe it is, in which there are some desert pupfish. These are blind fish, blind cave fish. They live only in a few ponds in ledges in these caves. And so it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, because this is before the Endangered Species Act. The federal government said we have reserved groundwater. It's a national monument. We have reserved groundwater, reserve rights to groundwater to keep these fish alive. Went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The ranch owner surrounding the monument opposed this. And the Supreme Court said, yes, yes. Guess what? The water level in the caves is still falling. The fish are going extinct. This was like 40 years ago that decision was made. I mean, you know, because you've got to have someone who's going to follow up and enforce this. And the sad fact is, it hasn't been effectively enforced, and all too often that's true. So there are so many dimensions. Law is a tool. It can be used wisely. It can be used poorly. Even when it's used wisely, winning a lawsuit is not the end of it.
Thank you all.
I just wanted to, in regard to that one case, it reminds me of something, and I'm sure you folks in Utah have heard this before, what a Colorado water lawyer told me about water law. He said, look, I'd rather be upstream with a shovel in a ditch than downstream with a decree. And that's,
yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. These have been wonderful questions, and we have just a couple more minutes before we want to turn this panel over to Tom Maloney, the director of the Tanner Human Rights Center, for some final comments. And I believe there's an announcement prior to Tom. Someone wanted to make one, but excuse me, before we go there, I thought it would be nice if we could take just a couple minutes to try to synthesize some of the themes that have come out of the conference. Building on this panel, we're seeing certainly the connection between surface water and groundwater, and sort of groundwater litigation futures, and needing to understand groundwater far better than we do. We've discussed thoroughly, well, probably just scraped the surface, but water as a human right, and what does that mean? And we've heard sort of as a repeated theme throughout the conference that that's going to be really important for communities to begin shaping what that means. And water as a collective good versus water as merely a commodity, or reframing water as a commodity to far beyond economic organizing principles to more collective good and social and cultural interests. And this need for new paradigms, creative and soft pathways forward. And how do we create positive, sustainable water futures? So I'd just like to put that out, especially in the light of climate change, which seems to be lurking in the room all the time, but not overtly addressed by the group. But in that context, does anyone have some ideas and synthesis that they'd like to share from their experiences in the conference before we close?
Debbie?
Kim, and then, Madeline, please.
I just want to make one remark to all of that. Water for us is life. It really is.
I'm very happy to hear that. We had a dialogue last night, and everyone went around the room and shared their name and one word in association with water, and my word was life. So with that, again, I think I saw some hands in the room. Kim wanted to speak, and Simeon, are there others? We have just we could probably go a little bit over unless Tom's at. Okay, we have a little extra time.
So I'm glad that we're doing this, because I had sort of thoughts running through my head at the end of yesterday, but it felt like a long day, and we were a little bit over. So one of the things that struck me yesterday was various panelists and even keynote lecturers talked about the problem when we think too narrowly. And I think there's so many different levels where narrow thinking is a problem when we're talking about impacts of climate change. And one thing that struck me was values came up a lot. And if we think of our own values on a narrow versus a broad sort of plane or perspective. And so I'm struck, in one of the things that hit me is one of the first presentations, there was the value of the green tree canopy and how that's something that people value, the sort of aesthetic beauty. But then when we think on a more broad level of the value of the Great Salt Lake or the cultural heritage of the Goshute and the different tribes, I think if people begin to think more broadly in terms of values, then maybe that's one step towards, getting a handle on moving towards, valuing human rights when we're talking about the global water crisis and having people think beyond, I guess, their backyard to others' interests. So I think that broadening perspectives in terms of values in other ways is helpful.
I'd like to add to that. It would be presumptuous, I think, for me, maybe anyone, to impose a synthesis on all of this.
I
sure don't feel like I could.
2.5 days of presentations.
But there are some things that have stood out to me, and one of them is that water as a human right has been one of the principal focuses expressly from the outset in this conference. But a thing that has come up repeatedly and that I believe in strongly, and it's actually accepted in the community I live in New Mexico, is that water is a communitarian interest and resource. So I think that there's been a lot of talk or recognition of the fact that there are community rights and interests, and I think Professor Adler this morning talked about community responsibilities with regard to water and with regard to each other's needs or uses and interests in water. That, to me, is one of the things that's come out, is this concept of maybe perhaps giving greater force to the concept of a human right by also tying it to a communitarian approach towards water resource management or governance. And the other thing that has maybe stood out to me is something I think I've heard a number of people say, so I'll just mention it. It's not a particularly great insight, but there's been a consistent theme of people invoking or calling for greater recognition of a more enriched perception of the interests, needs, roles, values associated with water. To me, that's a big part of shifting the paradigm or the discourse about water decisions, is understanding that there isn't just a sort of narrow economic or narrow traditionally conceived beneficial use type of value to water, but in fact it has to be looked at in a much more holistic fashion.
Thank you, Simeon. Anyone else? Oh, we have someone over here who'd like to take a crack at this. Add your voice.
It was just, I really appreciated Madeline's comment at the end about who has been helpful. And I think, individual communities, taking it from the individual level to a community level is good because you get communities working together. But I think Bob brought up the point, it's communities' responsibilities to each other. And I think in a lot of these water issues, the powers of Las Vegas and those who hold, a lot of political and economic power is great. And so I thought your comments about communities supporting each other in that fight was particularly important.
Thank you very much.
Could I add? Sure. I know it's dangerous to quote the Prophet Muhammad these days, but there is a saying attributed to him that I think is useful. We are but walking water.
Nice. Forrest.
I would like to urge that conservation be a factor as one option besides human rights. I mean, you have to look at what's happening in Las Vegas. I mean, these folks have huge fountains, swimming pools, in some of the most hot part of the country, and a lot of that water is evaporating. And I would just at least like to suggest that the Goshutes at least have some fountains and swimming pools as well before they start pumping all the water out of that area. I mean, it's only fair when it comes to human rights that everyone has a right to not only water but pleasure, but we also have a responsibility. Now, these folks, they have a responsibility. If they're going to claim their human rights, then they need to claim their responsibilities to that right as well and conserve a little bit of that water.
Thank you, Forrest. I don't want to detain anyone that's on a tight schedule. We are getting close to the time, and I know that Tom would like to wrap up the conference with us, but we have a couple more that we could hear from. Let's see. In the back, there's another individual, and then LaDon. Gavin.
I was just going to, it was actually a similar point to Simeon's, but just what strikes me about this whole conference, and I think the thing that I think we collectively need to focus on for moving forward is just that community piece, and I think recognizing, what I keep hearing in all these conflicts is that people are drawing circles around themselves and trying to justify their own uses, and I think we need to start. We hear that in the debate between Utah and Nevada over quantifying their water right underneath Goshute lands. I've heard it said that Utah doesn't. Some of the decision makers feel they don't have a right to tell Nevada how to use their water, and it's flowing. That snowpack is flowing off of their mountaintops and coming into Utah, and all the users currently, the dominant users, are Utahns, and so they feel like they need to recognize that state line, and because the same thing's going to happen to them when they have their own water project that affects Wyoming or other states. They don't want anyone telling them what to do, but really we need to recognize that the Las Vegas community is doing what they're doing. They're putting forward this ridiculous proposal because they recognize they don't have water. They're desperate. And so they're putting another community, the tribes and people of the West Desert, in the same kind of crisis by threatening them with something that's fundamental to us all. And if we can't recognize the human right, which is really the community binding thing between us all, and figure out ways that we can work together, there's no other way forward. We can't rely on lawyers and laws to do all of this. We've got to figure out, what's fair and equitable between ourselves and make sure that we're not selling out the Goshutes in favor of the Las Vegans and every other scenario that we've heard over the week. So thank you. It's been great.
Thank you, Gavin. Ladon?
Thank you for allowing me to slip in under the wire. This question of values, I think I wanted the fellow in the back who spoke just prior to the one just prior to me, brought up an idea that I think I would like to push even further, which is about linking human rights and human needs and our consumption patterns. So I think human rights is really important for a lot of reasons. It provides leverage through courts, et cetera, but it also presents an idea of what are our basic needs. Our basic rights are based on this idea that there's a certain level of human dignity that comes from a very basic set of requirements. Swimming pools are not among them. And being able to rethink what human beings actually need in this way can help reframe our value set. And I think this also relates to a lot of what Madeline was talking about, that do we really need all of the things that we consume? Our ways of using energy and water and extractive industry, the way that we treat land and its products as products rather than as part of our ecosystem that we are also a part of, the way we separate ourselves as humans from the rest of nature, the way we try to dominate. All of these are questions of values, and that underlying sort of root metaphor of us as dominators is, I think, a sort of spiritual wasteland that allows us to continue thinking that economic issues are more important than everything else, or thinking that who has the power should be able to ultimately make decisions at the expense of those who don't have power or the land itself. So I think all of these things are connected with our consumption and our consumer society, and I think we need to be honest with ourselves that if we do intend to really change the way we deal with the planet, we have to question our own consumption.
Thank you, Ladon. So I want to thank, please join me in thanking the panelists. And thank you all very much for your participation. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Tom Maloney.